In this next tutorial, we're going to take a look at way of remodeling that SSD object. I have three objects that are very similar to each other, and there's only a minor difference in the appearance in this first one, but there's a significant polygon difference between the three. Let's look at this in wireframe. This one right here and this one are both subdivision surface objects, and this one is a direct polygon modeling. And that's what we're going to do in this next tutorial, is create a much more lightweight polygon model using a method called direct polygon modeling. If we delete these two and we take a look at this, let's turn off subdivision surfaces. It's a 90-degree angle with two edges on either side, and when we subdivide that, we get a rounding. Let's also look at this from the front view. And we can see that this rounding has a particular profile to it. And what if we wanted to have an even more circular profile? Well, this type of profile where we just put a simple bevel on a corner is really good for smaller corners. But when you get to a larger corner, it produces a slightly oblong rounding, and we may want that to be a little bit more perfectly rounded. What I'm going to do is duplicate this. Let's turn that off, Shift D, Y, and I'll move that right there. So in the second version, which still uses subdivision surface, we're going to take this edge, go into the bevel tool, 3 segments in a shape of 0.5, and I'll just put that about like that. And then when we look at this with subdivision turned on in the front view, let's turn subdivision on here. Then we get a really much more perfect circular type of rounding, but now we have a lot more polygons on this second one, so I think we could lower this to a value of 2, but we still have a lot of polygons. So let's do this one more time. Let's duplicate another version, and we're going to remove subdivision altogether on that one. Tab key will select this edge, come back to the bevel tool, but I'm going to do a value of 10, and we'll come and look like that. Maybe we'll take it up to 12. I think 12 works pretty well. And now we have the least amount of polygons. In fact, if we take a look at this, I've got statistics turned on. If we take a look at just this first one, we're generating 256 quads on that one. If we take a look at the second one, it's got 112 polygons to make that object. And then if we finally take a look at this final one, it's only got 16 polygons. So the modeling approach that we're going to do now is based on this methodology. Let's come into the top, and we're basically going to start the object off in the same way that we had started the previous one. Shift A, we're going to add a plane that we're going to initially set to 4 inches, and then come down to its object X dimensions and set that to 7 inches. Let's zoom to the extent. Command A scales it, or Control A on the PC. Tab brings us into edit mode. We're dropped into vertex mode. In fact, I'm going to zoom down a little bit more close to this so we can see more clearly. Bevel vertices, pull out, and we're going to set the width the same as we had done before, 7 inches. But in this particular case, we're going to go to a much higher level. Let's do 32 for the segments so that we have a much more dense mesh. But the thing that we need to consider is that we still need to think about a boundary loop of polygons between a long flat area and the curving area. Even though it may not be apparent, we need to have another boundary set of polygons, just like we had for the subdivision surface, to prevent surface normal smooth shading from progressing into the flat areas where you don't want it. So let's come on. I'm going to turn off that target so it's not visually in our way. Close this down, and we're going to use the knife tool, K key, come over here, Shift, click. I'm continuing to hold Shift, click, return, K, Shift, click, click, and return. Let's zoom down over to this area, and we're going to again use the bevel function. It's such a useful tool. Set the default to 2 with the shape of 1, which produces an inset type of function. And we need to switch over to active tool. double click in between these two vertices. We're in vertex mode. I like this because I can see the vertices in order to know how close to place something because the curve is so shallow there. Click, hold, and drag, and just pull off until you get pretty close to that. Let's do the same thing here. Click, hold, and drag, and pull until we get that new loop in place. Pretty close. It doesn't need to be exact. We need to give this some thickness now. So let's come over to face mode, A, and then E, and extrude this up by a value of 0.75, which is the same we had done before. We have the top selected. I'm going to hold the Shift key, select a bottom polygon, then do Select Linked Flat Faces, and then select Loops, select Boundary Loop. We're in the Bevel tool. And let's take this back to a value of 1 and 0.5, which is the default setting. That'll give us a 45-degree bevel. I'm in Active Tool, so I can click, hold, and drag on an existing edge and pull that out, something about like that. We need to divide this in half, so let's come over and with the loop function, click there to divide this in half, and we only really want to concentrate on half of this. Switch to face mode, A key, we're going to take the median value, which is the center of the selection, take that down to 0 along the Z-axis to center it. Option Z turns on X-ray mode so we can select through. We switch back over to select box so that we can marquee around the bottom X key to delete those. Let's rotate the view. Option Z takes us out of outline. This is the corner we're going to be doing more modeling work with, but we need to produce rounding around the corner. If we come over into edge mode, double-clicking this stops the selection at an n-gon, and we've got the big n-gon. So I'll switch over, select this top face again, do a select link flat faces, and then a select loops, select boundary loop. There we go. Hold the Shift key and select this down here. The approach that we're taking is we're modeling the actual polygons that are going to be rendered with, which is why they have much higher density. And we need to consider that we are transitioning from flat areas to curved areas back to flat areas, so we need that boundary loop of polygons. So we're going to come over to the Bevel tool, set segments of 2, and shape back to 1, which is what gives us the planar loops around an existing selection. Click, hold, and drag. Oh, I'm in select box, that's why that didn't work. We need to go back to Active Tool, click, hold, and drag, and just pull until you see that appear. We'll get something about like that. It doesn't need to be exactly specific. And we're going to close that. Let's switch over and take a look at this in the front. Drives me nuts when it makes you hunt for where you are. And we're going to select, again, this center edge that we've just beveled around. And we're going to come back and do another bevel. This produces the actual curvature. Set this to a value of 8, but we're going to go back to the default of 0.5, which gives you circular roundness. And then when I click, hold, and drag, we can begin producing that rounding up to and approaching that boundary point. So this loop here is planar to this flat region here, and that's why we put that there. But when we take a look at this, one thing that I'm noting is that it seems that the curvature is just slightly flat here. We have a control called shape, and that's what we adjusted. We went from 0.5 to 1, but it turns out we can fractionally adjust this in order to give it a little bit more roundness. And I'm going to pull this up to about 0.6. Let's switch into the top view because now we're going to work on this corner in the same way that we had designed that inset element, that red inset element in the first one. We're going to do the same thing now. Let's add with the loop cut tool, one loop cut there, and let's switch over to vertex mode, and we want to use the cursor to demarcate and figure out where the center of this arc is. So we need to turn on snapping, and let's set it to vertex mode. Make sure in this case it's in closest mode. If it's inactive, it'll behave differently. So we need to just come over and snap that right to that point. with the selection tool, select a vertex down here, and then we get its value along the y-axis, copy that, switch over to view, come down to its location and paste in that value for its y position, and there we go. So that's in place. And now let's remove these 4 polygons by pressing the X key. Now you're going to note that what we did not do in this one is we didn't come in and triangulate the corners like we had done in the previous tutorial. And this speaks to an advantage of doing a direct polygon modeling for hard body types of models, is that you don't have to worry about n-gons, and that's going to become more apparent as we progress through this. We're in edit mode, Shift A, we're going to add a circle. It's going to be enormous, so let's set that down to 0.5. That's still a little bit large. Now in the first video, we had to match up the segments of each quadrant of the circle to the radius of the corner, and we don't need to do that now because an n-gon is going to sit between the two, and we're not subdividing it, we're not going to be bridging, and so we have a little bit more freedom. So what I'm going to do is I'll take this up to 64. That's going to be pretty decent resolution. S key to scale this down just a little bit. F key to fill that with the polygon. Switch over into vertex mode. Select the top and bottom vertices, press the J key to divide that in half, and then in face mode, split this to become its own object. I'm going to turn off snapping so that now we can move this over, and then we just bridge these two edges together. And we're immediately going to come over and put 2 for the number of cuts, and then I'll select those immediately. Let's zoom down. These are boundaries that we're going to have between the curving and the flat areas. S key X and scale this until we get right to about there. So I'm looking at sort of the shape and size of that to get an equivalent size for that. Select these. I key to inset. We're now producing the boundary between a planar region and a curving region. That's the first thing we're doing. I key again, and we're going to come down to about like that. And then we move that down. E key extrudes this down. Come over, since it's selection, it will show up under item. With median, we want to set 0 in the Z axis. X key deletes those faces. Now we're going to come in, edge, to select there, and we're going to select here, and we're going to do the boundary loops around those corners using the Bevel tool. We need that to be a value of 2 and a shape of 1. We're an active tool, so click, hold, and drag, and pull that until we get looking about like that. Now double click to select those again, and let's reset this to a value of 8 and 0.5. And we click, hold, and drag to produce the actual rounding that we see. But let's also take a look at this. Do we want to consider the shape maybe being slightly more curvy? And let's take the shape here from 0.5 to 0.6 to give us that slightly better rounding. It's a perceptual thing, but I'm going to like that. Okay, now let's come into the top view, and we need to connect the outside to the inside. I'm going to find one logical location here and here, bring up the context menu, bridge those 2 edge loops. Now, just select a single loop and look at that. We go all the way around, press the F key to fill that with a single n-gon, and that's constructed. Let's press the tab key. We can see that nice and smooth. Let's turn on auto smoothing. Okay. Now we're going to turn our attention to this raised sort of bump feature. When we look at this, we spent a lot of time in the previous version based on subdivision surfaces and figuring out how to connect and patch all that together. And with this direct polygon modeling approach, we don't have to worry about that. N-gons can remain there. And the reason is because we have boundary, we're putting in these boundary loops between planar regions and curving regions, and that allows us to maintain n-gons within flat areas. At render time, they get triangulated, but we don't need to worry about that. Let's switch over into the loop cut tool. I'll add a loop there and a loop there. And let's switch to the top view. And we need to produce the curvature right in here like we had done on the first one. So we'll just repurpose these loops as we have it. I'm going to press, actually let's do this. I'm going to switch over into wireframe view and we'll switch over into vertex just because we can see. I need to switch over into select box so I can select these, and I'll move these over about like that. And then we're just going to begin forming a curve that we think we kind of like, something similar to what we had done before. And then this area, there's going to be, it comes around and it kind of curves around this way. Now this is going to be very different than the way we had done it with the subdivision surface approach. And I'm just going to come in and look at that. If you watched my tutorial on Nurbs curves, we're essentially going to take advantage of the process that I outlined in that tutorial. First off, I want to take this loop, move it closer, because this is going to essentially define the end of the curvature for that bumped raised region. I'm going to select all of the loops starting at that boundary point. We want to get this one, that's the terminal end. There we go. We're going to separate that to become a new object. And I'm going to call this contour source. And then let's press the tab key to leave edit mode, deselect everything, and we're going to turn off. In fact, let's rename this SSD drive so that's very clear what that is. Click, hold, and drag to turn that off. Press the tab key. This clearly doesn't have enough geometry to establish a curve here. Bring up the context menu. We're going to invoke subdivide, and we're going to use a really kind of a cool function. Let's take the number of cuts to 3. It's essentially linear at first, but if we set the smoothness up to 4, look what it does, is it takes that and it tries to match the general curvature of the shape that's already there, which works to our advantage. Switch over into vertex mode. Let's take this and just sort of move that until we get a shape that we think works a little bit better. But before we do that even too much further, let's turn on a subdivision modifier. So right now we have what I call naked edges. They're polylines technically. And if we apply a subdivision surface, let's take this up to a value of 3, we are now essentially editing a Nurbs curve. So that's the benefit of this, is we started with a polygon mesh. Now we're going to generate a very high resolution, smooth flowing curve that is effectively a Nurbs curve. I think that curve looks pretty good. I'm going to leave polygon edit mode. I actually tend to look at curves without being in polygon edit mode so you're not interrupted by the visuals of the cage. I think that works pretty well. I'm going to duplicate this, Shift and D, escape key, and I'm going to call, we'll leave that source, and this one right here, we're going to apply that specifically. Let's turn off the contour so we gain access to all of the actual vertices. Since we're directly modeling the polygons that are going to be rendered, we're needing to consider the resolution of our object. But I actually think down here, we're probably overshooting our target just a little bit, and I'm going to remove by dissolving a few of those on that sort of shallow region. Okay, now let's look down here. I think that looks pretty good, but the critical part is the endpoints here and on the other side match up to the geometry that we already have. So let's bring back in our SSD drive, go into polygon edit mode, and we need to further reduce the geometry of this area. So we're in select box, so I can marquee around these, all of these. In fact, I'm going to select, let's switch over into shaded mode, because that will make selecting that n-gon a little bit easier. Taking note of the fact that we want to leave this one connection right there. Dissolve those faces and they became one big single n-gon. Let's switch back into the top view, and I don't need this loop anymore, so in edge mode, I'll select this and do a dissolve edge function, and then we can do the same thing down here. Shift R. Okay, let's leave edit mode, and I want to select this duplicate flattened curve, G, Z, because I want to move it up just a little bit above the object. We come back to our SSD drive object, tab comes back into edit mode. We want to switch to the top view because this is going to be the projecting axis. Hold the shift key, select that curve that we just generated. That's now not technically a curve, it's a high resolution polyline. Come up to mesh and down to knife project. And what it does is it cuts a new n-gon into the existing big n-gon that we have. Okay, so let's come up here, turn off that curve, and now we have an n-gon here and one here. But critically, because we were careful in our planning, the vertices match up to that original source. That's what's important to understand. So then we do the same thing. We can look at that. And in fact, I can come over and test this G key, and you see how it is attached at that location. And that's what we want. It's not attached there. It's only attached at that endpoint. And this n-gon here, we get to leave that way. Let's switch over into face mode and top view, and we're in select box, so I'm going to hold the shift key down and marquee across all of those. This is going to be the planar region. Merge all of those by clicking dissolve into a single n-gon. Press the I key. We need to inset. Now this is going to be one of the areas that you have to watch for when you're doing this direct polygon modeling and the density of your polygon structure is greater. We've now got an overlap up here, and we need to kind of deal with that. So let's do this. Let's come over and uplift this since we have a selection handle right here. We'll raise that up about like that. And we need to also, before we come up and deal with that, let's produce the boundary at the bottom here that we need to have sitting between this planar region and the curving region. We'll come back over to the loop cut function. Let's do this a little bit close. Click, hold, and drag, and pull that down, somewhere right about there. Switch over into vertex mode, and let's position the 3D cursor to the area that we want to flatten to. Let's turn on snapping so that we can just place the cursor somewhere like about right there. Switch over to the scale tool. Press the period key because we need to move the pivot point to the position of the 3D cursor. Let's switch to front view so this is really apparent. And then we scale that down and set that value to 0. And now we have our boundary between the planar region and the curving region. Now we need to concern ourselves with what's going on up here. Let's switch over into a wireframe view. So this is something that you'll deal with when you've got these tight corners and you're dealing with a much denser polygon mesh. So we could manually come in and grab all the polygons and try and untangle them, or we could just rework this all together. And I think that's what we should do. It's easier to select polygons in a shaded mode. So I'm going to come over, let's see, I've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So I think these right here are the ones that I want to rework all together. Delete those 13 faces, and in fact, I'm going to delete the main n-gon that comprises the top of the structure. In edge mode, select this edge, hold the shift key and select that edge, bring up the context menu, invoke bridge edge loops. Come down to number of cuts, and we're going to do 12. We want one less than the number of polygons that we've deleted. That will actually create 13 total polygons. Come down to where it says smoothness, and you can play with this value. The default is 1, but I think that that's a little bit sharp, and so this is where you would come down and play with a slightly different variable. I'm not interested in what's happening right there. Okay. I'll select this edge, hold the Control key down, and then select that to do a loop. Select, bring up the context menu, separate that to its own selection, and then we're going to remove these polygons that we just put in place. X key, delete the face because we've got these open edges. Tab key to leave. We've got the separated object and the original object both selected at the object level. Context menu, join, tab, double click in edge mode to select that edge, which we can see. Hold the Shift key, then the Control key to do a select between, bring up the context menu and bridge those loops. And there we go. Now the vertices are not welded here and here, so let's select an extra polygon on either side of that, switch over to vertex mode, bring up the context menu, and then we're going to do merge vertices by distance, and it will report, as long as you've got a default value that's pretty small like that, it reported that it merged two vertices, and there we go. We have reconstructed that area pretty easily. Let's double click on the edge of this open boundary, press the F key to reconstruct a new n-gon there. Let's come into the top view, and we need to inset another boundary set of polygons. So press the I key, pull that in about that far. Okay, there we go. Now let's look at this in the front view, and we need to generate the topology roundness that comes down. So we'll switch over into loop cut function, add one loop cut, and then we'll switch down to the shrink fatten function, which moves elements along their own vertices. I'm going to switch back to active tool so that I can click, hold, and drag, and I can just move that up, and we'll move it up fairly high, about like that. Now we're going to switch back over to the bevel function. We'll leave it at 8 segments and a shape of 0.5. Click, hold, and drag, and we're going to pull out only about that far. At the bottom, I want to leave a little bit of space for another blend to happen to the planar region. So that's going to work pretty well. And this is where you could determine if you need to have more segments. So for instance, if we needed to have value of 10, we could adjust that. And then this is where we could also come in and play with the shape. If you want that shape to be a little bit more rounded or a little bit less rounded, that's something that you can play with. I think 0.55 is a good value. Okay, now up top here, there is a little bit of a bump, which we can kind of see. We're going to blend this a little bit better, selecting that using the edge slide function, click, hold, and drag. I'll move that in just a little bit closer. Now remember, our thought process is that this is part of a polygon structure. This whole loop is planar to the main polygon that we have on top. Okay, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because when we select this, we're going to use the bevel function again with only 2, but we're going to leave the shape at 0.5, which will produce the rounding. Click, hold, and drag, and we will blend between the major curving area and the slight bump at the top. There we go, into this planar region here and here. So when we pull back and we look at that, it's nice and rounded. Look at that. So final operation is to produce a blend down here. Select this loop. We're still in the bevel function. Let's take this to just a value of 3 and evaluate that. Click, hold, and drag, and we'll pull that up till about there. We still have plenty of boundary. And in fact, I think maybe going to 4 would give us just a little bit more resolution. It's a small detail, but I think that will work just fine. Deselect. And now we need to just pull this raised region down. It's a little bit too high, so I'm going to select the n-gon at the top, come up to select and do more, less, more, and then Shift R until, keep doing Shift R until we come down all the way right to there. We've still got our 3D cursor at that location, scale, and we're still in 3D cursor as the pivot point location. Let's come into the front view so that we can see this operation. Switch back, it switched on me. Okay, and we'll pull this down until we get something that is a little bit nicer. There we go. and it's something, I don't know, maybe I could pull up just a bit more. Tab key leaves edit mode, and we are done.